This picture is really meant to represent all the different parts that I've just very quickly gone through. So we see explanation skills as being at the sort of the center, the intersection of these three areas. The first area is language knowledge at the level of the word, the sentence, and at the discourse level. Then you've got the academic content, and as you could plug in there math, science, social studies, even English language arts as a separate content area. And then here the learning cycle, and by the learning cycle we mean the practice, the experience and the instruction that students get from the assistance of their teacher in the classroom. And you bring those three things together. Explanation skills, in a sense, give you a lens into those three areas. And then the role of formative assessment then is to assist the student in that cycle of learning, instruction, and experience. And the way you get that insight as a teacher is by closely observing their production of explanation skills in both oral and written language.
In looking at the work around the DLLP, it really lends itself to zoom into language. And not only is it paying attention to the language that students are using, but also being able to be intentional about teaching language. And and I reiterate this over and over, that it's not adding something on top of something you're already doing. It's not, something separate, but it's how can you teach and be intentional about the language that you want your students to be able to use in the content areas, in reading and writing, in math, in science, and how can this be embedded throughout the day so that students are constantly working on developing their language. What it also lends itself to do is to really focus on the areas of need. When working with English language learners, in my case I work with English language learners and Spanish language learners, and it's really, our students, as you already know, they're not empty vessels. They're coming into the classroom already knowing something, having some knowledge, some recollection of something. It's the same with language. It's just, there's areas of need, areas that we really need to be able to zoom in and really help them with. But most importantly, it's being able to listen in all content areas and listening to them engage in conversations during science, during math, as they're engaging in conversation about their writing, their reading. It's really really paying attention to those teachable moments where you can teach and help students develop their language within the real time, within, as you're teaching your content areas. So what I've discovered in, in really embedding the DLLP is, we can get overwhelmed by all the language features that we really need to assess students on. But what I've noticed is that even in the types of questions that I pose my students, even in the ways that they answer, that's evidence that I'm collecting of what they can and cannot do just yet, or where are they in terms of their explanations. It's helped us to really delve deeper into content areas and produce richer language, as we'll see later in a couple of videos. But sometimes, not sometimes, but we're all responsible for teaching certain vocabulary in science, depending on what units we're covering, in math, depending on whether we're teaching addition, subtraction, division. There's particular language that's embedded, certain terminology that students need to know. But when we teach it in isolation, it becomes even harder for students to be able to memorize and be able to use it in their practice. But when it's embedded into a daily routine, when it's embedded into something that they're just very used to, or they know that towards the end of this lesson I'm going to have to explain, then it just becomes a routine that they're used to, and it becomes language that is being used, vocabulary terms that are being used that weren't taught in isolation, but students are using to explain. First-hand experiences really lend themselves to allowing students to, again, develop language. not only does it help with develop language, but it also helps for you to assess what students are coming in with knowing before starting a unit, what they might need help with, and what potential next steps might be. You get to see trends across content areas, especially with the use of connectors. So what I try to do is that connectors that I'm using with my students in maybe in writing, maybe as they're sequencing or telling a story in some sequential order, then what I might have them do for math is as they're explaining their strategies, how might we be able to use some of those same connectors for you to explain your strategies in a sequential order. And then again, I'm just creating those opportunities for oral language practice in every area. Opportunities for implementation. It's scaffolding language through our curriculum, again, in every content area. I know that with colleagues, some of my colleagues who teach kindergartners or even preschoolers, even through a morning message, you're modeling the use of the language that you would want your students to be able to use. We see it a lot in narrative and how-to writing. In the areas of math, science, social studies, many of our older students began to engage in having to put together speeches, especially when they have to persuade an audience. So it's really thinking about each and every one of these opportunities as teachable moments where you can, teach language, but also assess the language that students are using. When planning instruction, I really think not only the content, but what language features will I be focusing on, or what particular language feature would lend itself to what I'm doing. So when conferencing with students, this is a conferencing log. And as you can see, I'm not only looking at what strategy students are using, but also what language feature am I focusing on. So before I conference with a student, it's very intentional what I'm looking for in terms of content and in terms of language. How do I gather the evidence? So yes, I can sit in conference with students, but those of you who already sit in conference with students know that you don't get to all your students in one session, in one math block. So sometimes you only get to 2 or 3 students, 4 max, 5. So what other opportunities do students have to develop language and for you to assess? Well, there's small group discussions, there's opportunities for students to present in front of a class and explain their work, or present even maybe a problem that they're having that they really need help from the class to help solve. And one thing that I really try to engage my students on is this whole notion of giving peer feedback, which allows them not only to explain their work, but to have to understand the work of others in order to help them determine the next step.